Semites in the Middle East. The Hebrews are one of the many Semitic peoples who have lived in the Middle East since about the 5th millennium BCE. Several locations have been suggested as possible places of prehistoric origin for Semitic-speaking peoples: Mesopotamia, the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, Eritrea and Ethiopia, the Arabian Peninsula, and North Africa. The Semitic family is a member of the larger Afrasian family, all the other 5 or more branches of which originate in North Africa or the Maghreb. Largely for this reason, some originally believed that the ancestors of Proto-Semitic speakers first arrived in the Middle East from North Africa. The ancient Semitic peoples are divided into 3 branches: Eastern, the Akkadians, the creators of the Mesopotamian civilization, who would later, mingling with the Amorreans, begin to take the Jews into captivity. Western, nomadic and warlike Amorites, ancestors of the Arameans, Phoenicians, and Jews, as well as the sedentary Canaanites and a separate Arab branch that emerged later. South, Yemenites, Ethiopians, and partly Omanis. As modern historians believe, Jews appeared in present-day Israel during the Bronze Age collapse, at about the same time that the Philistines colonized modern Palestine. The Philistines were the outstanding warriors of the era. They had their own navy. They could make iron swords and armor. They were skilled in the bow. They had a regular army and war chariots. The Canaanites had none of this before the Philistines. The Jews who invaded Canaan at the same time as the Philistines had no such weapons. Therefore, at first the Jews managed to capture only what was of no interest to the people of the sea, the highlands. In the Egyptian chronicles there appears a mention of the sea peoples, with whom Ramses II, Merneptah, and Ramses III fought. As a result of the defeat of the Philistines by the Egyptians, the Canaanites and Jews were able to strengthen in the lands of Palestine. The myth of Moses. All those who are little familiar with the Bible have probably heard the story of how Moses led the Jews out of Egyptian captivity. The legend, of course, beautiful, but has no relation to the real history. During the last century, many researchers tried to establish the identity of Moses, who he was to what Pharaoh got, in what years he led the Jews out of Egypt, but no reliable information could not be found. Although Egyptian history is quite accurately documented, there is not a single document that authenticates the identity of Moses. It turned out that the answer about the identity of Moses lies on a completely different plane and goes back to the person of the Akkadian king, Sargon the Ancient. In the capital of Akkadian Kingdom, Kisha, there was a coup. Personal cupbearer of Lugal-Urzababa overthrew his master. After seizing power, he began to call himself Sharumkin, which in East Semitic means true king. Subsequently, this name was transformed into the one under which we are familiar with this outstanding man, Sargon the Ancient. In order to justify his claim to the throne, there was a legend that Sargon's mother was of noble birth, but immediately after his birth she put the child in a basket and sent him down the Euphrates. The boy was found and brought up by the water carrier Aki. When Sargon grew up and became a gardener, he was noticed by Ishtar, the goddess of love, who promised him her special favor. Thus the favorite of the goddess got into the inner circle of the Lugal-Urzababa, and then rose above the other kings. The motives of the miraculous rescue of a child sent down the river, and then becoming a great man, are very often found in the tales of various peoples. The story of Moses was probably borrowed from the Assyrians during the Babylonian captivity as a way of raising the spirit of the people and giving hope of deliverance. There are no records other than the biblical story, which fully coincides with the Akkadian myth, confirming the historicity of Moses. Now let us return from myth to real historical events. After defeating the Philistines, Ramses III settled them next to Israel. Over the following centuries, these neighbors were in constant conflict and fought wars that shaped the future history of the Jews. The Philistine advance on the land of the Jews was halted when the 12 tribes of Israel united to fight against the Philistines, who had managed to gain a foothold on the fertile coastal strip. The Israelites chose Saul of the family of Benjamin as their king. The prophet Samuel predicted great trouble because of the choice of king, but they did not listen to him. Saul won a number of victories over the Philistines. One of the dramatic episodes of this war is David's victory over the Philistine Goliath. But then the setbacks began. caused by claims to power by the ambitious and intelligent David of the tribe of Judah. When Saul and his sons were killed in battle with the Philistines, David, Saul's son-in-law, was elected king. He drove the invaders out of the country, subdued the last independent Canaanite city-states, and took their impregnable cliff-top city of Jerusalem, founded by the Jebusites. This city became the capital of his state, whose borders were greatly expanded. David began to control all trade between Egypt and the Middle Kingdom. Under him, Jerusalem became not only the political but also the religious center of Israel. During Solomon's reign, the Temple of Jerusalem was built in Jerusalem, the main shrine of Judaism, which allowed the unification of Israel and through which the national identity of the Jews was formed. The significance of this temple remains to this day, which is the holy site of three world religions. After the death of King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel split into the northern kingdom of Israel with Samaria as its capital, and the southern kingdom of Judah with Jerusalem as its capital. The reason for the breakup is considered to be the taxes that the kings imposed on the northern tribes, with the exception of the two southern tribes. Eventually the southern tribes went to Solomon's son Rehoboam, and the 10 northern tribes to Jeroboam of the tribe of Ephraim. The northern tribes immediately weakened the cult of monotheism, began to include the old Canaanite and Phoenician cults, which according to the southerners was apostasy. In time, therefore, they ceased to recognize the Samaritans as the tribes of Israel, considering them lost. As soon as Israel was weakened, the Egyptian pharaoh Sheshonq made a swift raid on Judea, took and plundered Jerusalem and many other cities in the country, and immortalized his victory in images and inscriptions on the wall of the great temple of Karnak. Soon also Phakai, king of the northern kingdom of Israel, attacked the kingdom of Judah and took many captives, but at the persuasion of the prophet Oded returned their freedom. Phakias and the Syrian king Rezin, having made an alliance between themselves, planned to depose the king of Judah, Ahaz. Ahaz, in straitened circumstances, appealed to the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III to help him against his enemies. Tiglath-Pileser III conquered Damascus, conquered several northern cities of the kingdom of Israel, Gilead, Galilee, and all the land of Naphtali, and took the inhabitants captive to Assyria. The significance of this victory was enormous. First, the once powerful kingdom of Damascus, which was at the head of almost all anti-Assyrian movements in Syria, ceased to exist. Secondly, the situation predetermined the end of the kingdom of Israel, which became helpless, surrounded on all sides by Assyrian possessions. Thirdly, Ahaz, king of Judah, became a vassal of Assyria and paid a huge tribute for his supposed independence. Finally, with the subjugation of Gaza, the Assyrian armies came close to the border of Egypt. Then the Israelite king Hosea, who had previously been an obedient vassal of the Assyrian king, allied himself with Egypt and refused to pay tribute. Tiglath-Pileser's son, Salmanasar V, undertook a campaign and defeated Hosea's army, but for some reason the Egyptians did not come to the rescue. Hosea was captured and sent to Nineveh. That same year the Assyrians began a siege of Israel's capital, Samaria, which they took after nearly 3 years of siege. There was also Sargon II, one of the greatest rulers of Assyria. As well as Sargon the Ancient came to power illegally, as his name King of the Lawful indicates. What became of the previous king Salmanasar V? From what he died, history is silent. Sargon found Assyria in an extremely difficult position, surrounded on all sides by hostile coalitions. As a result, Sargon was able to inflict defeats on strong rivals, the Kingdom of Israel, Egypt, Urartu, and subdue Babylon again. After Sargon's defeat, Israel and Urartu could not recover. The Kingdom of Israel fell first, resulting in the displacement of 27,000 noble families. These Jewish families were eventually assimilated and disappeared as a people, and the fate of the 10 lost tribes is unknown. All modern Jews are descendants of the Kingdom of Judah, which would conquer Nebuchadnezzar the 2nd century later. The remaining inhabitants launched a great revolt, led by Elubidi, king of Ganata. The revolt began not without the knowledge of Egypt, and later Damascus, Arpad, and Samarra joined it. Sargon, however, put down this revolt harshly, defeating the armies of the Philistines and Egyptians who came with the king of Sivit. Pharaoh Shabaka himself, frightened by the successes of Sargon II, sent him his gifts. Semitic princes and even the king of the Savoys in Yemen, Itamari, who gave Sargon II a lot of gold, horses, and camels, did the same. By the end of Sargon's reign, the entire ancient East, not excluding Egypt, recognized the hegemony of Assyria. The truth about the lost tribes there is one nuance. Later Samaritans, inhabitants of northern Israel, asserted that not all were taken away in slavery. According to the version of the Samaritans themselves, they are the descendants of the Israelite tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, who were not expelled by the Assyrians and kept the original Israelite faith. In time, they built their temple in the city of Shechem, opposing it to the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which caused hostility among the Jews of Judea. Remnants of the Samaritans still live in Holon and Shechem and worship the God of Israel on Mount Gerizim, overlooking the city. Soon Assyrian rule came to an end. Nabopolassar defeated the Assyrians with the help of the Midians and freed Babylonia from Assyrian rule. His son, Nebuchadnezzar II, became the greatest king of ancient Babylon during the New Babylonian Empire. He absorbed all the former regions of the Assyrian Empire and crushed any resistance offered. The next thing he did was move on the kingdom of Judah in Canaan and destroyed its capital, Jerusalem, sending the inhabitants of the city to Babylon, a period known as the Babylonian captivity. Further resistance from Judah led to another round of military campaigns between that reduced the kingdom and scattered the population. Nebuchadnezzar is remembered not only as a conqueror but also as a great architect. Babylon became so impressive that it was considered the center of the world, not only by the Babylonians themselves but apparently by other nations as well. The Hanging Gardens of Semiramis became one of the wonders of the world, and the famous Babylonian gates became a recognizable symbol of Babylon. The new Babylonian kingdom did not survive long. Soon rose a little-noticed tribe of Persians under the leadership of Cyrus, with whose reign began the creation of the greatest Persian power. First, Cyrus conquered Media and Lydia, and then it was the turn of Babylon to fall, which neither the walls nor the waters of the two rivers have not saved. The king of Babylon, Nabonidus, surrendered to Cyrus and was sent to remote Carmania in eastern Iran, where he died. The inhabitants of Babylonia were traditionally promised the inviolability of their homes and property. After the fall of Babylon, Cyrus allowed the Jews whom King Nebuchadnezzar had once taken to Babylon to return to Palestine and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The capture of Babylonia made such a strong impression that all the western countries up to the borders of Egypt, that is Syria, Palestine, and Phoenicia, decided to recognize the power of the Persians voluntarily. The image of Cyrus left a deep trace in ancient literature. The Jews saw him as a great liberator. From that time on, a dominant model of Jewish ethnic development began to emerge, including a symbolic and cultural center in Israel and a vast diaspora. Originating initially in Mesopotamia and Egypt, the diaspora spans North Africa, Asia Minor, Syria, Iran, the Caucasus, the Crimea, and the Western Mediterranean. The Babylonian captivity left a deep mark on the Talmudic tradition. As a result of communication with the Babylonian sages, the mystical books of Enoch and the prophet Daniel appeared, telling of the resurrection from the dead. The concept of waiting for the end of the world and the Messiah, which had been present before in Zoroastrianism, also emerged. A century after the liberation of the Jews from the capital of Persia, the high priest Ezra arrived in Jerusalem as the official representative of the Persian king to put the Jewish community and religion in order. At the same time, he introduced strict regulations, ordered the dissolution of marriages to foreign wives, and separated the Jews from the Samaritans. Ezra also introduced innovations into the Jewish religion in connection with ideas that had arisen in the Babylonian captivity. Thus Jewish mysticism, later known as the Kabbalah, was born. The time of Alexander the Great. According to the Talmudic version, when the Samaritans heard that the Greek army was approaching, they sent an embassy to Alexander and persuaded him to march on Jerusalem and destroy the Jewish temple. The relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans had not developed since the time of Ezra. The Samaritans considered themselves to be descendants of the 10 tribes, while the Jews, who had returned from Babylon, declared them to be descendants of the pagans who had been moved to Israel by Assyria and did not allow them to rebuild the temple. Upon learning of the impending danger, the high priest Shimon put on his holy garments and set out to meet King Alexander. Alexander, accompanied by the high priest, entered Jerusalem and visited the temple, where he offered sacrifice to the God of Israel. By annexing Judea to his domain, Alexander the Great left the inhabitants internally free. He allowed them to practice their religion and be governed by their own laws, as was the case under Persian rule. After conquering Egypt, Alexander the Great founded the famous trading city of Alexandria there, on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, and populated the city with Greeks and Jews. Many inhabitants of Judea voluntarily moved to Alexandria and enjoyed there all civil rights on a par with the Greeks. Some of the Jews joined Alexander's army and took part in the Eastern campaign. After Alexander's death, Judea was first subjected to the Egyptian Ptolemies, and then it was recaptured by the Syrian Seleucids. Thereafter, the area was a constant bone of contention between the Ptolemies and Seleucids, and spawned 6 Syrian wars. During this era, Greek culture infiltrated the Jewish environment. The upper classes assimilated Greek mores and customs, and the ancient Greek language spread along with Hebrew and Aramaic. At the same time, 3 philosophical and religious movements spread among the Jews: the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essay. The most popular was the doctrine of the Pharisees, who by means of interpretation sought to adapt the foundations of the Mosaic legislation to the new conditions of life. Another direction was held by Sadducees, representatives of priestly and aristocratic classes, who demanded from people blind fulfillment of rites, not allowing any interpretations. The third direction of the Essenes was mystical and contemplative, and consisted in withdrawal from worldly vanity. By the time of reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid Empire began to crack at the seams. By that time it began to be called Syria. After being defeated by the Romans during the reign of his father, Antiochus the Great, Rome began to exert a strong influence over the Ptolemaic states in Syria. Antiochus Epiphanes himself was held hostage in Rome to honor peace agreements, and each of the rulers of the warring states tried to enlist Rome's support. To control Judea, Antiochus took the rash step of trying to forcibly Hellenize the Jews, which led to a revolt known in history as the Maccabean Wars. The revolt ended with the liberation of Judea from Syrian rule. The liberated Judea proclaimed Mattathias' son Simon, the founder of the Hasmonean dynasty, as ruler. Gradually, the Hasmoneans began to expand the territory of their possessions, practically restoring the territory of the first Jewish state, and even increasing it. Simon's third son, Johanan Hyrcanus, conducted a number of successful conquests, expanding the limits of his possessions, and annexed Moab, Idumea, and Samaria. Thus, the non-Jewish Semitic peoples of the Negev and Cisjordania were incorporated into the Jewish nations. After John Hyrcan, his sons Aristobulus and Alexander Janai reigned. The latter was succeeded by his wife Salome Alexander, who became the only female queen in the history of Israel. The next stage in the enslavement of the Jews was Roman rule and the invasion of Judea by Gnaeus Pompey. A dispute broke out between Salome's sons Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, as a result of which the Roman commander Pompey was called in as an umpire. According to Josephus Flavius, both Aristobulus and Hyrcanus promised Pompey's envoy Scaurus a bribe of 400 talents, but he tilted in favor of Aristobulus, not least because of Hyrcanus's additional demands. When Pompey entered Judea, however, Aristobulus began to show signs of independent politics, whereupon the Roman general withdrew his support. Aristobulus tried to reconcile with Pompey and promised him a large reward and the surrender of Jerusalem, but these promises were not fulfilled. Pompey then finally broke off all relations with Aristobulus and took him prisoner. When Pompey approached Jerusalem, the supporters of Hyrcanus and discontented Aristobulus inhabitants opened the gates of the city to the Roman army, but the adherents of Aristobulus retreated to the Temple Mount and strengthened there. After 3 months of siege, the Temple Mount was taken. Judea became a kingdom dependent on Rome, but Hyrcanus did not become king. Pompey granted him the title of ethnarch and recognized him as high priest. A number of cities dependent on Judea became part of the province of Syria. In due time, Alexander Jannaeus, the husband of Queen Salome, named the talented administrator Antipater as governor of Judea with the capital in the now Syrian city of Petra. But Antipater was much more cunning, and entering into favor with Pompey, he became the guardian of King Hyrcanus, in fact seizing power over the Jewish people subjugated by the Romans. Antipater appointed his sons Herod and Phasael as viceroys in Galilee and Jerusalem, beginning a new Herodian dynasty. To establish himself as governor of Jerusalem, Herod traveled to Rome and was able to convince the triumvirate of Julius Caesar, Gnaeus Pompey, and Crassus to make him king of Judea. On his way to Rome, Herod also secured an audience with Cleopatra, queen of Egypt. Pompey himself soon died fleeing from Julius Caesar in Egypt. Julius Caesar appointed Hyrcanus as ethnarch, but de facto power in the country passed into the hands of Herod the Great, who already at the time of Pompey's fall managed to replace his former patron in time. After Caesar's assassination, one of Hyrcanus's sons, Antigonus, allied with the Parthians and captured Jerusalem in an attempt to assert his independence from Rome. However, Herod, backed by Roman authorities and 2 regular legions, recaptured Jerusalem. To increase his legitimacy, Herod married Mariamne, the granddaughter of the high priest Hyrcanus, thus inbreeding with the Hasmoneans. Once in power, Herod massacred Antigonus's supporters and made sure that the deposed and captured last Hasmonean king of the Jews was executed in Antioch. Herod's reign was marred by terrible omens, an invasion of the southern tribes and a great earthquake in Jerusalem, which killed about 30,000 people. However, Herod came out of the difficult situation with honor. He established contact with the new Roman power. The first Roman emperor, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavian, expelled the aliens and began large-scale construction throughout the country. Herod the Great's most important work was the rebuilding of the Second Temple. In the suburbs of Jerusalem, by order of Herod, built an amphitheater where gladiatorial fights were held, was built Caesar's Port with a theater and many other buildings in the Hellenic style, which caused discontent of the conservative part of society. The last years of Herod's reign were marked by special suspicion. Thus, on denunciation, he ordered the execution of his own sons. Herod the Great died at the very beginning of our era. According to his contemporaries, his death was the result of a terrible disease from which he suffered greatly. According to Herod the Great's will, after his death, Judea was divided among his 3 sons, Archelaus, Philip, and Antipas. Archelaus was to inherit the royal title, which Antipas also claimed. The Bible describes Jesus' encounter with Herod. It was Antipas, governor of Gaul. Herod Antipas's association with Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip, was publicly denounced by John the Baptist, which was the reason for John's imprisonment and later execution. Herod Archelaus was dismissed by Octavian because of excessive cruelty and was replaced by Herod Philip and his amorous wife. From that moment, Judea as a kingdom ceased to exist and became a Roman province. Under Herod Agrippa, Judea was united again and reached its former size. In the middle of the 1st century, the Sicarii movement gained strength in Judea. Tension between the local population and the imperial administration grew until it culminated in the Jewish War, which resulted in the complete destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem. Only the Wailing Wall remained. The revolt was driven by a movement of zealots. The revolt covered the whole country of Israel and even spread to large Jewish communities in neighboring Egypt and Syria. In Alexandria, Damascus, and other cities there were killings and street battles, in which tens of thousands of people were killed. At the head of the rebels stood the high priest Anna. Among the leaders were Joseph ben Mattityahu, known as the historian Josephus Flavius. The rebellion was able to suppress the future emperor Vespasian, to whom Josephus Flavius was taken prisoner. Thanks to it, we now know many details of that epic. Completed capture of Jerusalem's son Vespasian Titus. In 100th decade, Emperor Hadrian has decided to build on a place of Jerusalem the Roman city Aelia Capitolina, which should decorate a temple of Jupiter. At the same time, a decree was passed forbidding circumcision. These measures and the desire to turn Jerusalem into a pagan center caused the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was brutally suppressed. The Romans renamed the province of Judea Syria of Palestine to erase the memory of the Jewish presence there. After the destruction of the temple, and especially the defeat of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the bulk of the Jews left for Mesopotamia, where the spiritual and intellectual center of the Jews had been located for 8 centuries. At the same time, Vast streams of Jewish emigration went to Egypt, along the entire African coast to Morocco, and crossed over to the Iberian Peninsula. Another emigration flow went to the Balkan Peninsula, along the entire Black Sea. From here it reached Kiev along the Dnieper River. Extensive Jewish colonies also sprang up in Rome, northern Italy, southern France, and the Pyrenees.